Good morning. I am Nandan Unnikrishnan and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first episode of Rethink. The world around us is constantly changing and it is increasingly becoming apparent that Asia is playing a pivotal role in this evolution. At Rethink, we want to explain to you some of these changes through talking to policy experts, public figures from across the globe, and to discuss with them the opportunities and challenges that confront Asia and the world. In our first discussion, we are privileged to have in the studio Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, the Director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is based in London, and Dr. C. Rajamohan, Distinguished Fellow and Head of Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Today we will be talking in depth about the Iranian nuclear program, and we will look into the implications it has for India. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let me start with you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. You've written extensively on Iran's enrichment program and where it has been. Tell us, do you really believe that they're close to achieving weapons-grade enrichment capability?
Iran has been working on its enrichment program for over 20 years, 27 years probably, and they've gotten very close to being able to produce weapons-grade enriched uranium. In fact, all they need is a political decision. Were Iran to make that political decision, they could produce a weapons worth of highly enriched uranium in a matter of a couple months, probably.
Dr. Rajmohan, to you, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has in its latest report said that it's unable to provide credible assurance about the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran. This is one of those unknowables situation. What is your opinion?
I think there's absence of evidence, has been famously said by Mr. Rumsfeld, is not evidence of absence. So I think there are issues out there between IAEA and Iran in terms of the compliance of Iran with its obligations to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think India, many countries have consistently said that, look, Iran should sort out these issues with the International Atomic Energy Agency.
As part of this sorting out, there is a process of negotiations. The P5 and others are involved in it. What is the status? They met in Almaty recently, or Astana in Kazakhstan. Was there any progress?
I'm not sure there was any progress or not, but the body language coming out of the meeting seemed to be positive. They met 3 times last year. Those meetings can't really be described as negotiations. They were just each side presenting its initial demands, its maximalist positions. There was no real give and take. Iran didn't really want to have a negotiation. And this time in Almaty, the 6 powers adjusted their presentation. They demanded less and they offered more. So they already made some concessions, and Iran responded in its public relations positively, but they didn't in the negotiations themselves provide any counter proposal. They said they may do that next time. So we have to wait and see before drawing any conclusions about whether this was a success or not.
But would you say that this is better than being deadlocked?
Well, it's certainly better to have some glimmer of hope that diplomacy can resolve the situation, because so far sanctions, sabotage, other covert actions have not slowed Iran's program. They're getting closer and closer to this point where they could, if they make a political decision, make a dash for it. And this really worries some of Iran's neighbors, most particularly Israel, but not only Israel. So if diplomacy fails, other states might decide to take matters into their own hands and to employ a military option. That's why diplomacy is so important.
I just wanted to add here, I think one new thing that's happened, I think there is this P5+1 and Iran dialogue. One of the new things that's happened, I think, once Obama won his election, the second term, that Mr. Biden, who was in Munich at the International Security Conference, where he said that, look, US is ready for a direct dialogue as well. And the reaction to Iran, some of it has been negative, some of it has been positive. But clearly, the idea of a direct bilateral dialogue, I would think in the long term, is far more important than the formal one between the P5+1 and Iran. So I think it is really what the US does and how the US and Iran, because Iran has always wanted a direct bilateral dialogue with the US.
I have to jump in here and disagree with you on this, Raja. Actually, the United States has been seeking a bilateral dialogue for the last 3 years. They send Farsi interpreters along to these negotiations. Iran doesn't want to talk, and Iran still didn't want to talk. The supreme leader said, we don't want to talk with the United States. So it's up to Iran whether they want to talk, and it's up to the United States to make it worth their while, maybe. That's your point.
Yeah, I think the issue, I think the Supreme Leader Khamenei's statement, I think what he said was, look, we can't talk with a gun to our head. Yeah. So I think there is a little space, I mean, not too much, where the question of under what terms that how do you create the conditions? I mean, like in all difficult negotiations, the preconditions, how do you reduce them and how do you bring the two sides together? I mean, that's one important thing. I mean,
so that brings us to another interesting question is, and since this program is essentially going out to an Indian audience, what is India's take on all this, and can India actually play a positive role in trying to resolve this conundrum?
I think India has repeatedly said that, look, it does not want further proliferation in its neighborhood. Clearly, India does not want to see Iran as a nuclear weapon power. But at the same time, India has also said that, look, Iran has a right for peaceful nuclear program and that the issue must be sorted out peacefully. To some extent, President Obama himself is now emphasizing a diplomatic solution. So I think that is some advance. But I don't think India should over-determine its position that, look, somehow it can help negotiate, because I think US and Iran have a long history of negotiating. They've done it before. They've had some contacts. For example, even in the last decade, I mean, after the Iraq war, before that, after the Americans ousted Taliban from power, there've been some contacts. So I think they're very well capable of finding a way out, and India can help in a sense, encouraging everyone, rather than a direct role where it can compel either side to actually change its position.
No, but not in terms of compulsion. But do you think India is being too neutral in this negotiation? Do you think India could be a little bit more proactive rather than just sort of try and hide under international, let's say, resolutions, if not sanctions? Is there something India could do more than what it's doing now?
I think I would say purely at the diplomatic level. I mean, I think because the costs of this crisis prolonging and the confrontation between US and Iran, or between the international community and Iran, would have severe effect on Indian economy. I mean, today oil prices are at $117. If that goes up, even with military tension, we don't have to actually have a conflict, that would create huge complications for India's macroeconomic situation. So therefore, I think we have a stake. But the question is, how much can you actually do on the ground? But I think overall, politically, diplomatically, we should keep supporting a direct bilateral dialogue between US and Iran.
Before I come to the question on sanctions, one more question to you, Dr. Rajmohan. What is the regional approach? I mean, the other countries in the region, how are they reacting to Iranian programs, nuclear programs?
Yeah. As Mark said, look, there's a lot of, focus on what Israel says, whether Israel will use force or not. But the real concerns are with the Arabs. That look, Iran's neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Arab kingdoms, they're petrified by the expansion, what they see as an expansion or the rise of Iranian power. So they are deeply insecure with the prospect of an Iran that becomes so strong that it would have severe consequences for their security. So it's not a problem merely between US and Iran, or it is between Israel and Iran. There is also a serious dimension of Arab, Persian, Saudi, Iran layers here, which I think for us are far more consequential.
No, could you just elaborate on that? Why is it consequential for India?
Because I think if there is a fight between these two major regional powers on each side of the Persian Gulf, then I think the destabilization that will follow, the consequences for the Shia-Sunni dimension of the conflict, all these will seriously affect India because we are so connected to the Gulf.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, there is this whole thing about debate going on about the sanctions and their efficacy. Some maintain that actually they have been efficient because the Iranian elite that has been targeted is suffering. The revolutionary army is, as it were, under pressure. There are others who say that it has not been as effective as it should have been because people are being deprived of medicines. There are cases of hospitals not having sufficient drugs. What is your understanding of the situation?
I think the sanctions issue is a very important one, and there's no doubt that Iranian innocent people are suffering. They have been unable to acquire medicines from the United States and Europe, even though the United States and Europe don't prohibit the supply of medicines. It's the banking sanctions that create complications. But Iran could buy as many medicines as it wants from India, and India sells them at prices and with a quality that Iran could use. So I think the Iranian government is manipulating this medicines issue. The overall impact of sanctions, I think we have to realize that the most severe sanctions have been in place for less than a year. So it probably will take some more time before they would have the real impact that we all desire of changing Iran's decision-making. But even if they don't change Iran's decision-making, they're having an important impact in delaying some of Iran's programs, particularly its missile program. Iran has not been able to acquire ingredients for the fuel for its most powerful missile, and that has an impact.
But doesn't this, in a sense, generate within the Iranian population a kind of an anti-Western feeling? Doesn't this sort of feed into what is called Arab Street, if you looked at what's happening in Arab Spring, where there is this back to our nationalist roots, as it were, movement, and which is anti-Western in its expression? Doesn't this create problems then? You
know, there's an academic supposition that sanctions could create this backlash against the West and greater support for the government. I don't think that is observable yet to be able to tell that. Most of the poll results, which are very unreliable in Iran, but the reactions from people tend to blame the government for its overall economic inefficiency. And yes, they do blame the West for sanctions, particularly this medical issue. It's a serious issue, and I think steps have to be taken to try to relieve the suffering on this particular point. But I think it's unfair to say that the sanctions have turned the Iranian people against the West. There's just not a great deal of evidence to say that.
Dr. Rajmohan, I mean, we agree that, okay, the sanctions, there's still some more time for them to bite, as it were. But is the threat of military action real? I mean, is it looming large on the horizon?
No, there is constant talk of it. In fact, if you remember, during the president's re-election campaign, there was a lot of talk, look, in October he'll be under pressure, the Israelis would, take the initiative and the president will have no choice. But I think the Americans acted quite firmly, did their best to prevent, Israeli adventurism before the elections. And the president, the Secretary of State is going to, Mr. John Kerry, is going to be in the Middle East this week. The president himself plans to go to Israel. I think the U.S. fully understands the importance of not letting Israel drive the agenda. But at the same time, a lot of American Congress, a lot of people in the American Congress strongly think Israel's interests and concerns must be protected. So I think in the longer term, the U.S. has clearly an interest in ensuring Israeli security, that Israel will not be put in a difficult situation because of the Iranian nuclear program. But they don't want Israel to complicate things further.
The way you've been putting it is, it sounds as if essentially everything is in the hands of the United States and Iran. Are you suggesting that the role the international community can play is really very limited? Or is there something the international community can do at all?
I'm sure Mark has a different answer, but I would say in the old days, the shorter form of international community was the US, in 2 words. But I think there is an international community in terms of legitimacy, how this whole issue concerns many people. But I think it's fundamentally, I believe, I could be wrong, is that, look, there has been a complex relationship between US and Iran, going back to the overthrow of Shah of Iran, the hostage crisis. So there's a deep animosity in the US in terms of how they were treated. You've seen this film Argo now, it kind of brings us back some sense of that. And in Iran, again, there is a deep animosity towards the US in the sense that, look, the US supported a coup against Mossadegh, a nationalist. Then, they helped Shah run a repressive regime. But I think at the same time, there is also a lot of affection in Iran for the United States, which is at the popular level. If there's one country, if you take a poll, which is the most popular Western country, I'm sure they'll come up with the US as the. So I think it's a very complex relationship between the two. You could say love-hate relationship. So I think in the end, they have to talk to each other. They must find a way to talk to each other, because that would produce, I think, better results than having Germany and Britain, with due respect to them, they don't bring anything to the table. It is really the US.
Well, I hope Iran and US making friends is not a nightmare for others. Mr. Fitzpatrick, would you agree with what Dr. Rahman just said?
Essentially, I agree that the United States is the most important player for Iran. The United States is the country that can provide either the threat to Iran's security or the assurances that drive Iran's insecurity. The United States is the power behind the sanctions that have imposed such a devastating price on the Iranian economy. But I would say that there is a role for the international community. The Iranian people are modern, sophisticated, internationalist in their perspective. They don't want to be isolated. Now, when the Europeans isolate them and Americans, they turn to other countries, and many of the other countries of the world talk to Iran in ways that make the Iranians think that they're not isolated. You asked earlier about the role of India. You know, Iran looks to India as one of the major powers in the world that is supporting Iran. Now, we know that India is not exactly supporting, but that's the way it's interpreted in Tehran. And I think if India sent a signal that it is not supporting, that it would go along with sanctions that are imposed by the United Nations, which India does. But a stronger message to Iran, I think, could help to persuade the Iranian people that they are in danger of being really isolated.
I wanted to add something here. I mean, I think the importance of the bilateral dialogue. Now, the US, I think, in trying to construct a multilateral approach, because we saw Bush go into Iraq unilaterally. So as a reaction to that, the Democrats and the Obama administration has focused more on creating a multilateral structure, bringing the sanctions through the United Nations Security Council and reinforcing them through its own unilateral sanctions. Now, this process, in a sense, involves actually each time they go to the Security Council, they have to pay a price to our Chinese and the Russian friends. And it's quite clear that the Chinese and Russians don't fully agree with the United States. So the multilateral approach is weakened by the fact that Russia and China are not fully with the United States. And at the same time, they bargain with the US. So the US has to spend a lot of political capital to keep the coalition together. But while actually the US will have a lot more options if it directly, unconditionally negotiates with Iran.
So you're regretting Mr. Bush's departure from the international scene, I can see. But however, let me come to the final question. Let's assume we're in dreamland and you have this opportunity to talk to the policymakers who will listen to you and resolve the problem. What would be, in a minute, your advice to them?
You know, okay, so let's assume that the policymakers of the United States, because it's the country that Iran cares most about, yet it's the country that Iran won't talk to. Why won't Iran talk to the United States? They fear that U.S. policy is regime change, and that any concessions that they make will only encourage more pressure. So the United States somehow has to send the signal that regime change is not the objective. No matter all of the human rights violations that Iran is undergoing, we should criticize them, but we should make it clear that we accept the existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran, accept that it is a legitimate country and that regime change is not the objective. If we can only overcome that resistance on the part of the Supreme Leader, there might be a chance. If he just thinks that any concession will lead to his overthrow, well, then there's no chance.
I think here I agree with Mark. I think the instincts of President Obama have been in terms of how to view Iran, to treat it as a legitimate government. You recall his initial proposal that, look, we're ready to engage you. If you unclench, we'll unclench your fist. We're ready to shake your hand and let's take the process from there. But I think the problem for Obama has been the domestic politics. In a sense, the Congress has been pushing him to take tougher and tougher positions. And there, I think, an alliance between different groups in the US Congress. And it's not just the neocons who are against Iran. I mean, the liberals are actually as much opposed to Iran. So there is a strong coalition, domestic coalition, which wants a tougher posture towards Iran. While the president recognizes instinctively, I think, that you got to find a softer touch in dealing with Iran. So I would say, if there's one suggestion, I would say more power to President Obama, and he needs to find a way of changing the terms of discourse in the United States. We hope he can succeed, because I think it matters to all of us that a good relationship between US and Iran and a resolution of the problem will be in the interest of everyone.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was definitely a very insightful discussion, enlightening. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Rethink.